This guy doesn't look so bad. He's kind of a pushover. Oh, what the? He can do that? Why can he do that? What is it? What? Oh boy! The DLC to one of my favorite games is here, and it's DLC for the game. I can say that without spoiling anything. About the review, that is. I'm going to talk about the game in its entirety because this takes place at the very end of the game, so it's going to be super spoiler heavy if you haven't played Final Fantasy 16 yet. But with that being said, let's just jump straight into it. The DLC was announced and dropped at the same time at the Game Awards this year. Shadow dropped. And, I was super excited. I'm like, wow, more content for one of my favorite games. They announced that they're doing the DLC that was released that day, Echoes of the Fallen, and a future DLC called Rising Tides, I believe. Echoes of the Fallen was a little less obvious unless you actually play it, but Rising Tide looked like it was related to Leviathan, who was so oddly absent from all of Final Fantasy 16, and it didn't make any sense. I mean, even the final boss wouldn't use his powers, and he's supposed to have all of the powers. Anyways, so this DLC drops, and I'm super psyched. I'm like, okay, first thing tomorrow, I'm gonna play it, and I'm gonna beat the whole thing in one sitting, which wasn't hard because it wasn't super long. It took me 3.5 hours. I think a lot of people took just about 2 to 3. I actually live streamed the entire thing if you're interested in seeing my live reaction and everything. Not that there was much going on, but if you're curious. But before I talk about the actual content of Echoes of the Fallen, which is what released that day, I wanted to talk about the previous DLC release that was completely free. Just some little costume updates and things like that. And they're really cool, actually. I like them a lot. And you can do cosmetic weapons. So if you want to use one sword, but you want it to look like a different one, you can do that now, which I thought was really neat. The only thing I didn't like is you can only do that from the stone in the main hub. You can't just do it on the fly. And so, for example, like in this DLC, when I was getting new weapons, I had already went to the base and set my weapon to look a certain way, but now I got these new weapons that look cooler, and I was unable to go back to the base to change how my weapon looked. I could equip them, but it would just look like the previous cosmetic I had chosen, and I couldn't go back and change it. So I don't understand that. I really think that's just ridiculous how you can't change the cosmetic part of your weapon on the fly, and it has to be in a certain section. Maybe I'm missing it completely, but from what I understood, that was not something you could do. So yeah, the free contents for this DLC were pretty cool. There's little costume changes, and I use them just to have a bit of variety. Now, for the actual DLC, Echoes of the Fallen. This was sold for about $10. I think the Leviathan DLC is going to be about 20 or maybe 25 because the season pass I want to say was 30. So I got the season pass, got this DLC, and I won't get the next one when it comes out, obviously. The length is, like I said, took me 3.5 hours. I'm not including any replays or anything. I just played it once. For $10, I don't think that's that bad. I think it's fine. It's more of the same game, but it sort of just depends on how much mileage you actually get out of this game. If you don't get much mileage out of this game, I don't know if you're going to want the DLC at all. But again, we'll get into that in a minute. And let's talk about the story placement. I mentioned earlier, but this takes place at the very end of the game in a regular playthrough, and it would be right before you fight the final boss, or somewhere around there. And so if you don't have a save file already in that spot, good luck, because you're going to have to get back to that spot if you want to access the DLC, which I get, I understand. It's kind of tough when you put it in that spot. Luckily, I had a save file before I had beaten the final boss, because I usually try to keep one, but if you were unfortunate enough to save over your current run for New Game Plus or anything like that, you would have to have finished New Game Plus and then have that save available to access DLC. Not a huge deal, but this isn't something you can jump into unless you do have that save point from before the final boss. So not a huge deal. Let's talk about the actual content that was in the DLC. The story is that there are these new crystals that are coming out of seemingly nowhere, but they expire very quick. They only get a few uses out of them, and then they're kaput. Then they're done. So you are meant to figure out where the hell they're coming from. And so that brings us to the new characters, which are the ones who discovered this new mother crystal. There's a new mother crystal, and they're just mining it for the crystals to sell, because at this point in the game, all the crystals are dead, pretty much. I think they all are dead. And the new characters I just thought were so unbelievably bland and uninteresting. I actively did not like looking at them. I didn't care for them when they were on screen. There weren't very many, just a couple, but I have nothing positive to say. They were just fine. If anything, they were annoying. Was just a negative. Yeah, there is another mother crystal, and so the whole thing is you're trying to figure out where the hell it came from. What are these crystals? What does it mean? Well, the Fallen, who created these giant structures, which actually it's in a structure that has been visible since the base game, which get into this in a second. They were able to start creating a mother crystal from scratch somehow, and it's uncovering that lore. And so basically, they had these experiments and things like that, and eventually they figured out they could turn creatures, living things, into magic crystals. They just didn't work quite right, because they, only got like a use or two out of them or whatever. They're also cryogenically freezing different creatures, so there's some different older creatures that you could fight, and that's some good fights in them. So yeah, I thought the story to be pretty interesting. Not like crazy, but not, like actively boring. It could have been a lot worse. It could have been like the new characters, just completely uninteresting. That's going to bring me to enemy designs. I'll wrap up the story aspect when we talk about the final boss, but first I want to talk about the enemy designs. I thought they were pretty cool. A lot of them are reused, I believe, from the base game, but the actual new enemy designs are super fucking cool. Like, the mini bosses are dope. The final boss is dope. There's also a new combat mechanic, surprisingly, and it's called Hearthflame. It basically is where a magic enemy will cast a shield onto its fellow enemy, which has a little number above it, which is the number of hits you need to inflict before you can start damaging that enemy. So it's like this new kind of shield. And the whole thing behind it is if you hit it physically, like with your sword, you will take damage from it. So you're meant to use magic attacks on it, which is an incredible concept. That's such a new layer to combat that could be so cool. But I found that it seemed like you could still brute force your way. Now, let me clarify that this is all on New Game, not New Game Plus. So maybe it's different on New Game Plus, but just an average New Game playthrough, okay? It felt like you could still just brute force your way through it just by mashing buttons, which is my biggest complaint with this game, which just brings me back around to the combat. Even after all this time, I haven't played Final Fantasy 16 since I dropped my review, and I thought, I love the story. I thought I would come around to the combat a little more, and I still haven't. I still don't like the combat. I still think it's boring and lifeless. I don't know. I'm a bit negative here. But I do like the mechanic. I just wish it wasn't so easy to still physically overcome. I like the idea of trying to force you to differentiate your attacks. Like, hey, you should throw some regular magic attacks in there. But I still didn't feel like I needed to at all. The dungeon. Let's talk about the dungeon itself, which is where the final boss and the mother crystal is and everything. The placement of this dungeon made me beyond upset. Maybe that's why I'm so negative on this review. I think I was already feeling kind of negative on this DLC. So let's rewind a bit. The developers of this game claimed that they had no intentions of creating DLC until after the game came out. People were talking about it, which I even said in my review, that there's a good chance that's not true, and they're just kind of saying shit. There's no reason they can't just be lying. And they kind of were, and it's not a huge deal. It's just a little annoying because in the base game, there's this door up by around Rossfield, I think. It is there, you can interact with it, and your character's just kind of like, that's really strange. And so I was like, okay, this is going to be like a post-game boss or something. No. It never was accessible during the main game. In fact, it was the door to the DLC, which is unbelievably frustrating. It just kind of adds to the thought more that this game was either unfinished or they decided to cap it off at a certain point and just release the rest as DLC. But the door being there means they definitely plan DLC. I don't understand. You can't say the door was there and it was interactable. It never did anything until the DLC came out. I don't know. So that was a little annoying because I spent a bit of time trying to figure out how to get into that door when the game came out. And I was like, oh, I'll just be a mystery, I guess. I don't know. And yeah, it turns out it was for DLC. They claimed they weren't planning on making, but obviously they were. That rant was a lot better than I thought it would go, so I apologize. Still. But anyways, it's behind that door. That's where the DLC is. It's behind that door. Now you can access it, and it's this new fallen, temple thing, airship. And, yeah, I mean, the actual place itself is neat. Being positive here, the dungeon itself is absolutely fucking gorgeous. I mean, it is jaw-dropping, some of the scenery in this dungeon. It's just fucking incredible looking. You're ascending this tower the whole time, and the higher you get, the more you can see, just the surrounding area and the tower that you've climbed all the way up. It's just... that is stunning. And the music, of course, is always on point. The visuals, like I said, on point. Nothing to complain about in the visual or the musical categories. They are on point, 10 out of 10 still. Which brings me to the final boss. The ending of this DLC is the best part of the DLC and is a 10 out of 10 section, even if everything before it was not. The final boss is incredible. It's very neatly designed. The music track is insane. I mean, you can hear it now. It's absolutely insane. I'm a huge fan of this fucking music track. And the boss was actually hard for New Game. It was actually challenging. I died a couple of times on it and got really close. And when I finally did beat it, I had like no heals and no health. And it was tense. Like, you actually had to think about what you were doing when attacking. You could spam your abilities still, but you had to be actually moving out of the way of attacks and paying attention to what was being telegraphed, so you could dodge and then get in your hits, which I really appreciate, because before in the main game it didn't really feel like that. Anyways, it was sick as hell. This is an amazing boss fight. My only complaint is that I have to go through the whole dungeon again just to refight it, and the dungeon itself was not entirely like, if I did it right now I'd probably enjoy it, but I wanted to jump straight back into that boss fight again, and I had to go through the whole dungeon. I was like, well, fuck. So maybe New Game Plus one day when I do that. And before getting into the conclusion, I just want to talk about a few more things, how the story kind of wraps up. Basically, you get to the top of the tower and you fight the computer controlling the thing, which is this big weapon boss thing, and it's pretty cool. That's what the final boss is. I also wanted to talk about what it doesn't give you, which is fine, not a big deal. I thought maybe they would give you new iconic abilities for finishing the DLC, which they don't. Whatever, that's fine. I'm just hoping that the Leviathan DLC does give you iconic abilities and update the final boss to have the Leviathan's iconic abilities, because, I mean, it's God and he created everything. He should be able to use the shit against you, but whatever. So, let's come to the conclusion. What does this DLC add? / what is the point? To be honest, I think this was the post-game that should have been in Final Fantasy 16. FF16 didn't really have a post-game, it just had a lot of content. So I couldn't really complain that there's no post-game in the main game, because there was so much fucking content in that game. I spent like 90 hours in it. Like, I really can't complain. That's not even New Game Plus or any of the arcade modes or anything like that. But it did feel odd that there was nothing to do after you beat the boss besides just play the game again. Really strange. And looking back at it, this looks like this should have been in the game, especially because the door was already there, as an optional endgame boss, because there weren't really any optional endgame bosses. If you want to tell me the S ranks were optional endgame bosses, the dragon was. The rest were a cakewalk. Actually, the Behemoth King was pretty cool too. I liked him, but a lot of them were kind of cakewalks and just tasks to do. That's how I feel about most of the challenges game. But this DLC changed my mind on that. I do think it expressed how difficult and challenging and engaging Final Fantasy 16 can actually be beyond its story on a combat plane. What is the point? I just think this was post-game that was cut, and they're just adding in, charging $10 for it now. Not a big deal. I think it's worth the money. I'm not going to complain about that, but I'm not going to not call it what it is. Well, if I had to give this DLC a rating, I think it'd be a solid 6 out of 10. To be honest, if I gave the main game like a 9 out of 10, which I would probably lower now, the DLC definitely gets like a 6 out of 10 at best. Final boss is incredible. It is absolute peak in video games, okay? Don't get me wrong. But everything before it is, like, fine. There's nothing wrong with it. It's okay. You also get Cloud's Sword. That was pretty cool. A little crossover with FF7. FF7 Rebirth is coming up. I'm looking forward to that. Yeah, I just really hope Rising Tide is a lot better, because Echoes of the Fallen wasn't bad. It's just fine. Wasn't great, just fine. So yeah, that's it. I just wanted to put my thoughts out there on the DLC. Helps me get it out of my head and express myself a bit. And if you enjoyed watching this, I appreciate it. If you leave a like and subscribe if you want to see more. And yeah, let me know your thoughts in the comments, because I had a very negative outlook on this DLC, even though I was so happy to have more content. I'd be curious to see what the general consensus is on the DLC, because I haven't really looked into that. So just let me know what you think. If I'm like being a total asshole and way harsh, I'm cool with that. Just let me know. Yeah, just thanks for watching. See ya.